Do you fear death? The most common answer seems to be yes. The burden of grappling with non-existence is a dreadful experience that many, including myself, have had to deal with since they were young. From our limited human perspective, the very concept of being, as opposed to non-being, brings comfort, and death threatens to rip that comfort from our grasp. The fear of the unknown is one of the most powerful feelings we can experience, and throughout history, as a result of death's permanence, all we've been able to do is theorize as to what occurs after death. Some believe in simple non-existence, the loss of consciousness altogether, which for most people breeds anxiety. Some claim to find comfort in finality. They believe it simply makes sense that life, as with all things, must come to an end, which I can understand and sympathize with. But in the pursuit of ultimate objective purpose, that interpretation of death leaves me feeling hollow. It relegates transcendent purpose into a subjective, self-determined concept, which is as unstable of a philosophy as it is an abandoning of one of the core tenets of existence: purpose. Majora's Mask's thesis is love. Not despair or horror, as some may have you believe. The macabre nature of Majora exists to provide incentive. It need not be an avenue with which to revel in twisted and grim imagery or atmosphere, but rather should act as a motivator to overcome the darkness and emerge victorious on the other side. Not only for your own sake, but primarily for the sake of others. Today, I'd like to describe to you how Majora's Mask reflects and portrays issues I've dealt with throughout my own life, and in an admittedly semi-eisegetical way, explain my subjective interpretation of its thesis. My goal is not only to analyze the game itself, but ultimately to use Majora's Mask as a way to point toward the hope I have, in lieu of the seemingly inevitable termination of life. Majora's Mask is a miracle of a video game. Having been developed as the direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, it had some monumental standards to live up to. The development team was told they had to create an entire 3D Zelda title in under 2 years. Evidently, rather than building a new engine from the ground up, Majora's Mask utilizes the exact same engine Ocarina of Time did. In fact, the vast majority of assets were lifted directly from Ocarina of Time. Despite all of this, Majora manages to be the most unique title in the series. Mechanically, of course, but especially narratively. The tense and threatening nature of the gameplay and story are no doubt a reflection of the deeply stressful pressure felt by the developers working on the project. Allegedly, many of the townsfolk's lines, specifically the construction workers, were quotes from those working on the game, being required to spend extra time in the office, and assumedly pull all-nighters in an attempt to get the game released on time. A subtle and effective way to express one's grief. The ever-present dread evoked by the moon very likely represents the fear felt by the dev team when working under such strict time constraints. A tight deadline, always looming and peering back at them, eliciting urgency from both the developers and the player. In a way, Majora's Mask asks the player to step into the shoes of the developers and experience the heavy weight of a deadline that, if not followed up on, spells disaster for yourself and those around you. Now, of course, unlike in real life, you're allowed to retry saving the world if you fail, but that fact doesn't eliminate all tension. Oftentimes, the pressure you feel is derived from needing to be places on time, making promises you're expected to keep, and attempting to keep your schedule compatible with the flow of time. Upon replaying this game, I found myself genuinely surprised at just how accurately the 3-day cycle functions as a reflection of living. In the same way that some may consider mundane and uniform tasks in our day-to-day lives to be boring or functioning in a loop of sorts, playing Majora's Mask can really just feel like living. The more you do, and the more you change, the more accurate to life it feels. Ocarina of Time is meant to feel like a triumphant and exciting adventure, jumping from dungeon to dungeon and boss to boss. Majora's Mask makes you feel like an inhabitant of this world, an irreplaceable fixture in the society of Clocktown. In contrast to its strange, high-fantasy exterior, Majora's Mask is one of the most real Zelda games, and it's that simple reality that provides the narrative with the ability to impact the player on a deeper, more emotional level. Now, the impact of story is in no way a foreign idea to Zelda, but in creating a more grounded world that is susceptible to change, Majora is more readily able to tug at your heartstrings, without the player needing to suspend their disbelief. For example, example, let's compare Lon Lon Ranch from Ocarina of Time to Romani Ranch. Upon becoming an adult, Link discovers that Ingo, the underling of the previous ranch owner, Talon, has usurped his superior and gained control of the ranch, with the intent to honor and serve the great Ganondorf. Malon, Talon's daughter, has agreed to work under Ingo in the hopes that it'll prevent the ranch's livestock from facing abuse. It's a very good setup for a side quest. While the player's main goal may be to obtain Epona in order to progress throughout Hyrule, the side quest's narrative provides extra moral incentive. The goal, at least in my mind when playing as a child, was to gain access to Epona by freeing the ranch, and helping Malon was a good but secondary motivation. Majora's Mask, rather than dangling a physical reward in front of the player, often posits the fulfillment of moral duty as the player's reward. When first entering Romani Ranch, Link explores the lush, cultivated fields and comes across Cremia, a young woman whose job it is to manage and look after the ranch. When Link further approaches the ranch house, he meets Romani, Cremia's little sister. Romani seems very intent on defending her family's ranch from invaders. She claims that these invaders are ghosts or aliens, dead set on kidnapping the cows housed within the farm's shack, and requests for Link to fight alongside her the following night, when they will allegedly appear. In order to initiate Romani's side quest, Link first must pass a training test, in which he's expected to shoot a certain number of balloons whilst on horseback. Up until now, Epona had been entirely absent from the game, and instead of gaining access to her after completing Romani's side quest, you gain your tangible reward simply by visiting the ranch. All Link needs to do to progress in the main story is run away on Epona and jump the fence to Great Bay. But he doesn't. Despite already receiving the necessary item, Link, or the player, would hopefully decide to help Romani, unaware of what kind of reward they'd be given, if anything. Not only does the game provide incentive by arousing intrigue in the supposed aliens, but also provides immediate incentive, as if you fail to protect Romani and her cows, she gets abducted. The game doesn't give you an option to retry this encounter. Sure, you can play the Song of Time and attempt it again, but for the remaining 2 days, you must live with the consequences of letting Romani be kidnapped. The aliens do return her home, but now she's in a seemingly permanent state of daze, shaking with pain and barely able to construct a coherent sentence. The consequential nature of Majora's Mask indicates to the player not only that they must ration their time carefully so as not to bring unneeded harm upon the residents of Termina, but also serves to make them empathize with the characters all the more. Their immediate fate rests on your shoulders, and the unfortunate consequence of the time loop is being cursed with knowledge. The knowledge that you must sacrifice the well-being of another person during every cycle. Will you spend your cycle helping those who need it, or gaining the means to stop the moon from falling? Both are moral goods, and considering that ending the cycle spells hope for the residents, you'd logically want to blaze through the main dungeons as fast as you could. But nevertheless, Link is forced to live with guilt. The ends may justify the means, but that doesn't make the means any less painful. But the realism that Majora's Mask so perfectly represents is not exclusive to the consequences of your actions. It's also depicted through the grief of the characters. Clocktown's residents are divided. The townsfolk, rooted in tradition, recklessly desire to participate in the annual Carnival of Time, Clocktown's culturally observed holiday, despite the moon's extremely evident crash course, while the town guards are intent on fleeing the town, for the sake of themselves and their families. The mayor is unfortunately caught in between the discourse of the people, and is indecisive as a result. The slow descent of the moon is more threatening to Clocktown than any other culture, village, or people. Being located in the center of the map, the moon will inevitably crash directly into the town and annihilate everything in its wake. And the uneasiness of the locals extends far beyond just those involved in political debate. Most of the inhabitants simply fear for their own lives, some taking refuge within the town, some denying the moon will even fall, and some fleeing to neighboring establishments, like the ranch. Even the guards can be seen clasping their chests on the third day, having truly accepted the gravity of their situation. Clocktown is a community, a small, in-reach congregation that anyone can make a difference in, all facing a threat of quite literally cosmic proportions. The bulk of your side quests will be carried out here, reuniting Anju and Cafe, freeing the mailman, easing Guru's regrets, saving the bomb shop lady, but despite the majority of side quests being housed in Clocktown, that doesn't mean its inhabitants are the only ones plagued by grief. In fact, all 4 of Termina's main cultures are knee-deep in turmoil. The Deku of Southern Swamp grieve the loss of their princess by torturing her accused kidnapper. The Gorons of the Mountain Village are grieving the loss of Darmani, their tribe's champion. The Zora of Great Bay, or more specifically, Lulu, is grieving the loss of her eggs, having lost her voice as a result of her own despondency. And the long-dead spirits of Ikana linger on after death, grieving the loss of their kingdom. Many people have drawn a connection between the 4 provinces of Termina and 4 of the stages of grief. Woodfall representing anger, as they're fueling their rage into punishing an innocent victim. Snowhead representing bargaining, as Darmani's ghost asks Link if there's any way he could bring him back to life. Great Bay representing depression, as Lulu can barely bring herself to speak because of her immense grief. And Ikana Canyon representing acceptance, as the entire province's DNA is embedded with themes of death. Now, was this the writer's original intent? No, but it's still an extremely fitting and interesting idea to entertain. No matter where you go in Majora's Mask, you cannot escape death. Nearly every important story beat and character have to do with different elements of death, especially the 2 characters from whom you receive the transformation masks. Darmani, a Goron hero who died attempting to protect his race, and Mikau, a brave Zora who died attempting to retrieve his lover's soon-to-be children. You, as Link, are meant to soothe the regrets and pain of these characters, and carry on the duty that they themselves could not fulfill, going beyond simply stepping into their shoes, instead becoming them in a sense. Upon wearing the Deku, Goron, and Zora transformation masks, you're given the opportunity to see the world through different cultural perspectives, ones you potentially weren't able to sympathize with or understand before. Link is the main actor in this story. His job is to bring love into a broken world, to carry the burdens of others, to allow and teach its inhabitants to love each other, and in some cases, themselves, painting Link as a type of Christ figure. I have always struggled with death, and on a deeper level, existentialism in general. I often fall into very deep, hyper-skeptical patterns of thinking that eventually lead to terror. In my pursuit to think of everything in a reasonable way and reject foolishness, the serpent begins to consume its own tail. My pursuit of logic eventually becomes so emotionally charged that it results in illogic, leading me to question everything around me, sending me into fits of anxiety. And ironically, my second favorite game of all time, Majora's Mask, is deeply existential. But what I adore about Majora is how boldly it establishes its main theme to be love. Love in the face of unthinkable horrors. Many amazingly talented artists have written essays about this game, and what its love-infused thesis means to them. Oftentimes, these artists' personal interpretations of love land on humanism, a philosophy that, rather than appealing to religion or God, intends to simply do good for the sake of oneself and others, not by way of any transcendent purpose, but rather to contribute to the common good of bettering humanity. I personally believe humanism to be a logically inconsistent ideology. Do I believe in love being one of the most important actions we can ever take as humans? Of course, but I simply cannot bring myself to think it reasonable that love would be considered a moral duty in a world where all purpose is self-determined. Appealing to radical moral relativism while simultaneously claiming that a greater good exists and ought to be followed is contradictory and juvenile. The only way for love to mean anything in an objective sense is for that love to have an origin outside of our feelings. I'm a Christian. I believe that Christ truly did rise from the dead historically, and strongly believe that the universe was created with intent. Frankly, I find the opposing belief to be intellectually nitpicky at best. Now, to any agnostic or atheist viewers currently watching, I am not calling you stupid. I appreciate all of you for taking the time to experience my content so much, and I have no quarrel or prejudice toward you. I simply strongly disagree with the philosophical concept of an arbitrarily occurring universe. I was raised Christian and always belonged to a Christian household, but that doesn't mean that I had dogma after dogma piled onto me. In fact, I was encouraged to think freely by those around me. Questions were not shunned, but answered to the best of their ability. And the more I've grown, the more I've genuinely seeked out answers and asked questions. But rather than letting that deconstruct my faith in Jesus, it has simply served to grow my faith in him and deepen my understanding of what faith truly is. Despite being raised Christian, the fear of death still pervaded my mind from a very young age. Whether it be the fear of the void, fear of the unknown, or anything in between, I was traumatized by these thoughts as a child, and still live with the scars today. And it's precisely why I find Majora's Mask to be so meaningful and applicable to my own life. In a world where immediate death is constantly approaching, always looming over you, never letting you forget about its existence, there is hope to be found. Not the hollow, defeatist hope of merely pretending that life has purpose, but the hope of overcoming seemingly insurmountable and inevitable doom. Despite the main takeaway of Majora's Mask being, for many people, the temporal nature of life, I find comfort in interpreting Majora's ending as an allegory for eternal life in the face of death. Do I believe this was the writer's intent? Certainly not. But it's a very meaningful, albeit subjective way to apply the story of a game I cherish to my own life. After spreading love throughout the land, sacrificing your own desires for the sake of others, Link must play the oath to order and prevent the moon from falling. To me, the four giants represent God, and the moon represents death. I, on my own, cannot prevent the fear of death and non-belief from invading my mind. I'm only human, and appealing to humanism provides me with no ultimate comfort beyond my own psyche. But I don't need to fall victim to those things anymore. Genuinely believing in Christ provides me with an avenue to feel comfort beyond myself. Biblically speaking, belief in God fundamentally contradicts the fear of death. When in times of strife, I need not run to anyone but Jesus, just as a frightened child runs to their father. The giants proceed to grab hold of the moon and prevent it from impacting Clocktown. But before the moon is fully stopped, Majora detaches from Skull Kid and promptly ascends into the moon. Now, the player must push forward in the face of it all, despite thinking the horror was finally over. Upon entering the moon, the player is met with an ethereally beautiful and peculiar sight. Lush green fields, blue skies, and a tree. This has never been fully explained by the developers, but I choose to perceive it as a reminder, a final representation of the hope and peace you've been fighting for this whole time. Playing with the children and giving them masks is a reminder of the love you had for Termina's residents. The Fierce Deity mask is a representation of all the grief and memories of Termina, which, by the way, is confirmed to be canonical. And to me, the overall setting and atmosphere is a reflection of Eden, and the eventual redeeming of the Earth through Christ's return. Upon completing each of the 4 challenges presented to you by the masked children, they'll all ask you a unique and piercing question. Your friends, what kind of people are they? I wonder, do these people think of you as a friend? What makes you happy? I wonder, what makes you happy? Does it make others happy too? Your true face. What kind of face is it? I wonder, the face under the mask, is that your true face? The right thing. What is it? I wonder, if you do the right thing, does it make everybody happy? All of these quotes touch upon themes of moral good, your effect on others, and most uniquely, self-discovery. The unprompted nature of these questions are reflective of how real children often question things, with no concern for semantics or sparing feelings, just genuine inquiry, and it cuts so deep. I implore you to entertain these questions and apply them to your own life. After conversing with all 4 of the Moon Children, there's only one thing left for the player to do. Confront Majora. Majora as an entity is nothing short of unspeakable, embodying this deeply twisted and vile concept of evil. Unlike the usual villain, Ganon, set on eradicating the hero for his own gain, Majora is this chaotic, borderline arbitrary figure, portrayed as having serious demonic intent, yet simultaneously seeming senseless in action. Its mannerisms can only be described as inconsistent, sporadic, and at times almost humorously absurd, eventually culminating into what seems to be a very intentional and wicked being of destruction. Not much is known about Majora. It seems to act of its own accord and desires to carry out its evil designs. But what those designs are, or the motivations behind those designs, are ultimately left up to interpretation. Whereas Ganondorf was a man consumed by lust for power, Majora is its own power. It doesn't seem to draw from anything other than itself, making your triumph over the boss an eradication of evil itself, rather than eliminating an agent of evil. The obliteration of Majora, and promptly afterwards, the moon, leads to the final bell toll, dawn of a new day. Even the minimalistic swapping of colors makes this graphic represent hope in such a contrast to the previous ones. The new day perfectly represents the renewed hope I have in this world as a result of my faith. I need not subscribe to a bittersweet, hollow idea of defeatism. Majora's goal was never to make the inevitability of death the main point, but rather the importance of selflessness. And my personal experience with belief in God has led me to associate this ending with the comfort gifted to me in the face of death. It perfectly mirrors the cognitive overcoming of existential dread. Coming to the conclusion that there is life after death has provided me with incentive to follow Christ, rather than wandering aimlessly in a dark, chaotic world. I found my way onto the narrow path, and I truly hope and pray that those of you watching, those of you wandering through the dense, confusing woods of life, would stay open-minded and genuinely consider the fulfillment promised in Christ. I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst. I am not a preacher, or qualified at all to lead you on this path myself. That's for you in Christ to navigate, but I'd be a fool not to share the comfort I find in my belief. This game's narrative is not a story about God, but it reflects my own personal convictions and experiences in a very real way. My subjective interpretation of its themes helps point me back to the joy I have in my own life, and after listening to my story, I hope you're able to see how, to me, Majora's Mask perfectly embodies the necessity of faith, even in the face of death.